Kingdom Hearts 2 has a bad reputation. The meme is that it's just a game where the experience consists of mashing the X button, and sometimes mashing square. So what happens if you don't use this core combo system people argue breaks the game? As I illustrated in my Kingdom Hearts 3 review, I've played through Kingdom Hearts 2 at least a dozen times in my life thus far. Tons of times as a teenager when it first released, and then 4 previous times in the last 3 years. Once on Critical on the PS3 where I got the Platinum, once on Beginner just for fun, yet another time on Critical, this time getting the Platinum trophy on the PS4, and once on Critical Level 1. Not that any of this makes me special. Plenty of people have done this stuff and are much better at the game to boot. But it does mean I'm at least skilled enough to hopefully try other forms of self-imposed challenges. So I figured, since the current YouTube craze is all about self-imposed challenge videos, popularized by channels like GameChamp3000 and Sieve Gaming, I could try the same thing with Kingdom Hearts 2. As far as I could find, there's only one other video like this for KH2, where Skyward Wing completed the game on critical mode without jumping. It's a great video, by the way, so definitely check it out if it sparks your interest. So, in the spirit of these sorts of videos, today we ask the question, can you beat Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix without using Keyblade combos? So, a few rules before we begin. 1. As one would expect, we're playing the game on critical mode. This means we take much more damage than on standard, but have half the total HP that we'd get on proud. 2. We're not counting the Roxas prologue, because if we did, the challenge would be over before the first combat tutorial was even over. 3. As penalty for the above rule, I'm using the no experience ability until I gain control of Sora. 4. Now we get to the specifics. Firstly, no swinging your Keyblade using the X button, or using combo modifiers with square. This also includes retaliating slash. Any action where a Keyblade swings itself is okay as long as the Keyblade doesn't hit an enemy, and the Keyblade swing isn't the main part of the attack. 5. Reaction commands are the exception, because otherwise things like Rock Shatter would make the challenge impossible, and also because they're not specifically tied to Keyblade attacks. Plus, with a lot of them, it's really difficult to tell whether the attack is specifically done with the Keyblade or not. So to make it less complicated so that I don't have to go frame by frame on every reaction command just to make sure before I even do the challenge, we'll just say all reaction commands are allowed. 6. Blocking is allowed since the intention is defensive and it can't deal damage, though counter abilities tied to blocking aren't allowed. 7. Sora's part in limits is allowed as long as he's not alone like in Solo Trinity, and as long as he's doing special attacks. In any limit where the player can just freely combo using the normal combos, like Duck Flare, we're only allowed to use the actual limit attacks. 8. Drive form Keyblade swings aren't allowed either. I decided this includes firing magic bolts in Wisdom form, since they're Wisdom's direct replacement for attack. Not that this made any difference, as you'll see. 9. Mickey is not allowed to save us. And 10. This isn't necessarily a rule so much as a note. I chose to go with the rod for the bonus magic, but picked up the shield for ability layout. This is a case where I felt that getting second chance at level 49 rather than 65 was going to be more beneficial overall, assuming we get to level 49 anyway. In order to keep this video as far under feature film length as possible, I won't go through every forced fight, only the interesting ones. Still, buckle up for a long one because I couldn't shorten the video more than this. With that out of the way, let's get started. Once we finally gain control of Sora, our first fight is won with a series of nobodies at the train station entrance in Twilight Town. Luckily, in the first few fights we have Donald and Goofy with us. This means we're free to run around avoiding damage, while they kill our enemies for some free experience. Though, Even if we were by ourselves, this fight is one of many that doesn't need to be won. If Sora takes too much damage, the fight will simply end, and the game will carry on. The same tactic works for the forced fights when climbing Yensid's tower, though here we can at least help with any Soldier Heartless that show up, since they'll offer up the deadly Cyclone reaction command. It's after this that we get our first real combat option, is what you might think, until you realize that Valor Form can't use anything but Keyblade attacks. It's worth noting that this also means we can't get high jump either, since the only way to level up Valor Form is by hitting living things with your Keyblade while in said form. And, to add just a bit more salt to the wound, that means we can't get Combo Plus from it either, meaning our magic combo is stuck to 3 hits and 2 finishers. Saddened, but still determined, we move on. After this, we don't have another fight until we reach Hollow Bastion, the first of which is yet another skirmish against nobodies, and once more Donald and Goofy can gather up some free experience for us until the fight ends, or we die, which will continue the story. Finally, we see our first real combat option, Blizzard, and luckily it's right before our first forced fight, where we aren't likely to succeed just by watching our allies attack. This bit where you're defending the gate with Leon is one that generally sees people struggling for the first time when they initially play critical mode. The samurai nobodies here can decimate you if you're not careful, and our only option for healing is going to be the 2 item slots we have for potions. What I found worked best was to position myself on the side of the gate, once a handful of nobodies have gathered, then use Blizzard to destroy the lot of them. Once the samurai appear, we need to focus on blocking them so we can use the dual stance reaction command. Hopefully, Leon will at least distract the other nobodies from destroying the gate. We can fairly consistently rely on him to chip away at them with the help of the security system, and whenever we're free from the samurai, it's not a bad idea to use reversal on the Dusks so that we can limit their damage output to the gate. With a fair amount of skill, careful planning, and just a bit of luck, we have this fight done in no time. And in success, we find our second combat option already, Fire. Understanding how to use Fire in Blizzard will be rather important going forward. We need to remember that Blizzard pierces through enemies but costs more MP. Meanwhile, Fire can sometimes knock enemies into the air, meaning we can infinitely juggle them to death if we cancel Fire combos before we reach the finisher, which would normally knock them away. These will largely be our only combat options for a while. And boy, does it feel like a long while. The first Disney World we'll be stopping by is Land of Dragons. Almost immediately we end up in a fight with some Heartless in the camp. Luckily, this fight isn't too bad. Unluckily, you'll likely notice 2 problems we're going to face for the first half of this world: the morale meter and ping. Ping is not Mulan. Mulan is useful. Ping is awful. Since we're still going to be relying on our party members for a while we're out of MP, it's important that they can put up a fight. Ping has basically no combat options, and as such likes to just sort of stand around. The other issue is the morale meter, which drains over time. Grabbing orbs refills it, but if it empties completely, we lose. As I said though, we'll be doing a lot of waiting for MP to charge here if we don't want to grind for dozens of ethers to spam, so it's important to manipulate our allies into attacking enemies. This first bit is just a handful of shadows and 2 Nightwalkers. Nightwalkers are dangerous, extremely dangerous, since once they start an attack animation, Fire won't cancel it, and to succeed before we run out of morale in some of these fights, we need to be able to hit more than 1 Nightwalker at once, which is much easier with Fire than Blizzard. Still, this fight sees the morale meter falling rather slowly as long as we don't get hit, so our best option is to take it slow too. Luckily, they chose to focus on Ping even after she was knocked out, so MP charge was a cake for me. Next up are the 3 trial fights, which can be done in any order. The surprise attack mission takes place in the screen over, which is a fairly open area. This gives you plenty of room to avoid taking damage. There are 15 Heartless in all that you have to defeat, including several more Nightwalkers. This fight can be a challenge, but as with the last one, not getting hit can allow the morale meter to sustain for quite a while. I tried to capitalize on moments where my allies got in good attacks by rushing in with magic combos. Otherwise, the only other major help in this battle are the carts and fireworks nearby, which can explode for massive damage against our enemies if we play our cards right. It's not easy, but eventually we prevail, and the second mission, the ambush, begins. This is much the same as the previous, but with harder enemies, or at least they would be harder enemies if we were reckless. Assault riders prey on players who love to get too close. They're not the easiest enemies to stagger, and they can dish out a lot of damage really quickly. Luckily, we have Blizzard, and no reason to go anywhere near them. This means they're extremely easy to dodge, so this more or less is an easier version of the previous mission. Speedrunning the game, we are not. The final mission, the search, is potentially the most difficult. It mirrors the first fight, but with stricter time on the morale meter, and a more frustrating relationship between ally AI and enemy spawns. This time we have to find the handful of Heartless that are hiding around the camp. They will always spawn in the same spots, and always in the same order as far as I experience. However, since they spawn all across the camp, it's difficult to keep your allies from getting stuck on all of the tents set up everywhere. It wasn't uncommon for me to find that Donald or Ping ended up halfway across the arena, continually failing to jump over a tent that they can clear 2 times over. I can't really explain what the proper movements are to get them to avoid getting stuck, but if you're careful, it can be done. We can try to destroy tents with fire combos, but to make it on time would require wasting ethers, which isn't worth it yet. Other than that, it's another fight where we simply have to avoid getting hit. I found that the shadows can be a bit tricky here. They love to sneak back into the ground right before you hit them with a spell, and even just 1 extra MP charge means the mission becomes impossible without ethers. After this is a short trek up the mountain. The morale meter is here as well, but it's hardly a problem since we can skip most of the enemies. I only engaged them when I was afraid they'd knock me out of Rock Shatter. If you spawn a few of them before you get to the final rock wall, the assault rider that would normally spawn here won't, so we're free to escape with minimal issue. Further up ahead is yet another room that normally gives players a bit of trouble, but since we don't have the morale meter to contend with this time, we can play this more careful. When safe, I spammed fire combos on the shadows, and blizzard combos from afar on the assault riders. Easy peasy. At the top of the mountain is a timed survival against tons of rapid thrusters and bolt towers. Speed trap for the easy win. After this, we finally gain access to Mulan and her powerful fire-based attacks, including the Red Rocket Limit command. The final battle before the fight with Shan Yu is at the entrance of the palace, all the way back down the mountain. A few Nightwalkers perfectly positioned to be fired to death, and some more bolt towers make for a quick victory. At last we're at the world boss, Shan Yu. I personally found this battle shockingly difficult at level 1, but here it wasn't so bad. The biggest annoyance is his bird, which is really difficult to avoid if you're focused on other things. Yet another gate is under siege, but this one is so easy to defend that we don't even really need to pay it any mind. I just occasionally dropped by and picked up any morale orbs lying near it to recharge the meter. Shan Yu himself doesn't put up much of a challenge. At the beginning of the battle, I spammed Blizzard until just about out of MP. I then would enter the Red Rocket command and enjoy the free damage. This is more or less the cycle of the fight. I focused on staying safe well on MP charge, but if you want to be more proactive, you can try to bait out sword slashes from Shan Yu. Blocking these will always enter you into a struggle reaction command that gives you some free damage when you succeed. This is also the main way to deal with his darkness attacks, where he powers up and then zooms across the screen toward you. Just be careful, because missing any of these blocks will lead to a ton of damage, and likely death. Beast's Castle is the first real challenge we face, and for a while, it'll only get more difficult. Smart people will equip the hidden dragon Keyblade, by the way, which we got from the last world, since its MP rage ability will be invaluable for pretty much the whole run. Anyway, the first fight here isn't worth saying much about, it's just a lot of shadows. Win or lose, the game goes on. After these comes the battle with the Thresholder. This fight will be over in 2 phases no matter what. Making it past the second phase will be the hard part. At the beginning, we are immediately assaulted by 2 giant fists. Block and then move out of range. Once the attack is over, we rush in, where 2 gargoyle warriors will spring to life. Run back to the safe end of the room as soon as this happens. Defeating these statues isn't difficult, but it is somewhat luck-based. They're immune to magic as far as I can tell, so our only option to defeat them is a special stagger state they enter if we block the correct attacks. For the sword variant, most of his attacks work. For the axe version, I could only get him to stagger correctly if I blocked his spin attack. Doing so will freeze the statue in a stunned state for a few seconds, at which point we can simply run up and use the release reaction command to instantly relieve them of their possession. Now onto the fight itself. The first phase is total cake, since the Thresholder will only use one attack if we stay far enough away. Since this can't hit us, we're free to spam blizzard combos from the opposite end of the room. After 2 full bars of MP or so, his life will deplete. Now we jump in and release the Possessor from the door. This enemy doesn't actually do anything, instead it just floats around trying to avoid us. My first time I spent quite a lot of time with it just flying about, so I don't think it goes back into the door until you've taken off at least half of its health. Knowing this, we can wait for the hook bats that spawn when we get close to the Thresholder to begin an attack. They'll occasionally offer up the Bat Cry reaction command, which can do huge amounts of damage to the Possessor. 2 Bat Cries or so, and it'll retreat to the door. Here's where things get difficult. At this point, the Thresholder loves to repeatedly spawn darkness orbs that stalk us, and will send us into critical health from full health. Therefore, we need to block pretty precisely here. We can also use the safety of Bat Cry, which can block the orbs outright, but getting the command to show up at the right time is luck. This fight was the first real challenge. It took me a while and probably 24 tries. Torturous when you consider that the first phase is about 2 minutes of nothing dangerous happening. Eventually I was able to block just enough dark orbs, get just enough bat cries off, and even use a few blizzards to make it back to the Possessor phase. At this point I half expected it to have some new attacks I'd never given it the chance to do before, but it still just floats around helplessly, ripe for the slapping. An hour after we started, and we're only halfway through this world. The next area is the torch cleansing minigame, which was more about wasted time because I poorly used my magic a few times and had to go into MP charge. Then, we need to cleanse the Beast of his darkness. Cogsworth and Sora can fairly consistently stagger Beast using the charge reaction command. After that, it's just about spamming Blizzard at safe moments. At last, we reach Shadowstalker and Darkthorn. Shadowstalker is cake. If you know the attacks it can do and the pattern it uses, it'll never be a threat. However, doing this fight incorrectly will set us up for failure against Darkthorn. You see, at least with how I was leveled at the time, I was doing just the right amount of damage to consistently run out of MP on my last Blizzard cast against Shadowstalker. This carries into the Darkthorn battle, meaning we have no offensive moves for a good 30 seconds. Therefore, no matter what else we do, we have to make sure we have at least a single MP left when going into Darkthorn. In doing this, our first action against Darkthorn is to use Beast's Twin Howl limit. This does a decent chunk of damage, makes us invulnerable for a while, and leaves Darkthorn open to the Step Vault series of reaction commands, which will render him visible. From here, he was much easier to block since I don't have his patterns memorized. Important, since blocking was most of the fight. Once I got my MP back, I tried to throw any safe blizzards at him I was brave enough for, but eventually it would always get too dangerous and I'd immediately have to drop back into Twin Howl again. This fight isn't as hard as the Thresholder, but it stings more since instead of a 2-minute wait, we now have a 4-minute fight with Shadowstalker waiting for us each time we fail. Beating this fight gets us Cure. It also gives Sora Retaliating Slash, which as stated at the top, we can't use, so leave it unequipped just like all of our other combo options. Welcome to one of the hardest parts of the run. Firstly, we stop by Merlin's place in Hollow Bastion to get one of our best early options, Chicken Little. Now, we cry in despair at the realization that Olympus is next, so we can't use him for the vast majority of the world. Since our drive gauge is locked out until we get the Olympus Stone from Demyx, we're still stuck to only using Fire and Blizzard again. Plus, Cure is mostly useless as well, since using it eliminates both of our attack options. Fun times! First up is the Hades escape section, which was just as torturous here as it is in a level 1 run. So difficult in fact that after about 24 tries, I left the world and bought 2 Abass chains. Just those 2 extra points of defense they gave helped a ton, but the fire resistance also made it far less common that Hades' attempts to gank us would actually end in a retry. So how did this series of mob fights play out? The first fight was simple: avoid doing anything stupid and exploit backcry. Take this part slow, and we won't even take any damage nor expend any MP. The second fight is significantly more difficult. It's tempting to use Bushido, Orin's limit, but it just didn't do enough damage to justify the resulting MP charge. Orin is better as a distraction anyway, so that we can hopefully line up the enemies for a good bit of blizzard action, or wait for one of the Lance soldiers to open up to the Lance Tug reaction command. Lance Tug doesn't do a ton of damage, but it's certainly better than being vulnerable back on the ground. Lance soldiers are one of the few enemies in this game that I feel are kind of cheap, since their stumbling attacks can sometimes come out of nowhere, something we can deal with easily later on, but right now we simply don't have the options to do so, and blocking needlessly in anticipation can leave us open to other attacks like Hades' fireballs. Get past this second fight and the final one is more of the same, only double the Lance soldiers and even a large body thrown into the mix. I only got to this part like 3 times before I finished it, and even then, getting through this fight is a blur. I can't really tell you what I did other than more of the same as before. Cerberus is next. Cerberus is dead. That's how easy this fight was. Just stay away from him. I didn't even try for his reaction command. It's not worth it. He becomes a fairly good doggo if we just keep our distance. He'll focus on firing easy to block fireballs and more or less just do nothing else. Whenever our MP is full, we can jump blizzard spam until we're about to run out, and then use Bushido. First try for the win. And for that win, we get counter guard. Useless. Moving on. In order to keep with the theme of this video, I also did the next part without using my Keyblade to attack, and I am almost certain that the Maniac training with Phil is impossible in this challenge without spamming ethers. Only finishers break the urns. We have a minute 30 to collect 100 orbs from these broken urns. The urns float around fairly randomly, although they do seem to follow the player a bit, so we can kind of get them to bunch up. Every time we destroy urns, about 10 seconds later, the same amount of urns will respawn in a bunch somewhere in the arena. And destroying enough urns will cause a large one to spawn, which will drop large orbs worth 10 points instead of 1. With all of this in mind, the only way through is to line up the urns as best as we can and spam Blizzard through them. If one is too close to us, Sora loves to target it even without magic lock-on equipped, causing us to miss the bunch we're aiming at and just hit the 1 or 2 urns. If we miss even one spell, the attempt is likely over. By the end of our first MP bar, we need to have at least 30-ish orbs already. If we don't use an ether, we're waiting and then repeating. However, after that we still won't have enough points, meaning we'll more or less have to use an ether. Honestly, it's probably smarter to use the ethers before you run out of MP, since using them in MP charge doesn't immediately fill your MP, but using them with MP still remaining does. However, this means you're getting one less spell finisher out, and remember, spell finishers are the only way we can break the urns. On top of this, failing the training will eat any ethers we used, so it's important to save beforehand in case we fail. For this, we get Aerial Dive. Also useless. Moving on, Demyx is next, and he's just as cake as usual. However, success gives us the Olympus Stone, and finally allows us to use Chicken Little. As we enter the fight with Pete, we need to resist the urge to open up a can of chicken just yet. Chicken Little won't last through the full version of the battle if we use him now. This is nothing but a warm-up, so we can just bat-cry Pete into oblivion. Once into the part of the fight with Hercules by our side, we can call upon our poultry overlord and waste a punk. Pete can be a little dangerous, especially since he has Trick Ghost Heartless with him, but taking them out using Chicken Little's magnet ability is simple. After that, we play it safe, use spells on Pete when we can, look for the pinball reaction command if it shows up, and reflect his large bowling ball bombs back at him. For winning this fight, we get Trinity limits, something I didn't notice until a bit later. As such, I didn't equip it until after I beat the Hydra, who's up next. Good thing, Hydra's easy. He is a bit dangerous though, largely because of his dark orbs he can spawn, but they're consistent to block. So as soon as the battle starts, we need to jump over his tail and watch Donald and Goofy damage boost like champs. Then we quickly run into the corner. What we're waiting for is the Hydra to drop his head down and look around. When doing this, we can either do like I did and use jumping blizzards to chip damage him, or you could probably use Trinity Limit to actually hurt him good. Regardless, doing enough damage will allow us to decapitate him. He'll then shove his neck into the ground and spawn more heads. Dealing with this is easy, but requires more timing than usual. I didn't know until doing this run, but taking too long to cut off all the heads will lead to the Hydra spawning more, so we have to effectively whittle the heads down fast enough so that MP charge doesn't endlessly cause more to show back up. It's not too difficult, especially with "Get up when the Hydra's back!" Yeah, that, but it's worth noting regardless. After this, it's all about waiting safely in the corner again. Block orbs, use Blizzard or Trinity, and wait for the Hydra to slam his mini faces on the ground. Not long after, he'll offer up the Pegasus Run reaction command, which is the best way to deal damage in the later part of the fight. A few of these and he's down for the count. World complete, and a new spell in the form of Thunder finally obtained. From here, while things don't necessarily get easy, we've at least got enough options in our arsenal of abilities that they will get easier. Disney Castle is up next, and it's so simple that we hardly need to even use any of our ability options. There are only 2 segments here that we have to do, which consist of moving Minnie Mouse through the castle safely. The hallway is probably the more complicated of the 2, thanks to the minute bombs. Generally, spamming Faith with Minnie wasn't quite enough to kill them outright for me, but since it launches them so far away, they just end up despawning and respawning with full health. Therefore, I either had to get some fire spells off of them first and then use Faith, or use fire and then activate their dodge roll reaction command to finish them for good. The throne room, meanwhile, is absolutely full of bolt towers. That means it's cake. Spam Faith and coax Minnie through the room at a brisk pace. Timeless River ramps up the challenge yet again, though it's more so difficult if you're looking to avoid grinding your drive gauge back to full. Our first fight in Timeless River is against Retro Pete, who can only do damage to us by accident. He's extremely easy even here, though he took a few minutes since I was conserving ethers. After this are the 4 gates where we need to help Retro Mickey. Each has a mayhem meter, which if it gets maxed out, you lose. The first one I chose to do was the construction site elevator. Each time an elevator rope breaks, Sora and the enemies are launched into the air several times, and the mayhem meter increases. While this is happening, we have access to the extremely powerful air slash reaction command though, which makes short work of our enemies. We initially need to use Chicken Little to magnet the enemies toward us, then use fire until most of the hammer frames are dealt with. We need to be careful though, since after a while, minute bombs will start spawning in, and if we hit them with fire, they'll enter their self-destruct countdown. If a rope breaks while they're counting down, it's really easy to get blown out of the air. If we can avoid that, when a rope breaks, we just use air slash to our advantage whenever it's available. The second door I did was the miniature city. Our goal is to prevent the Heartless from destroying the city. In the center of the arena is a tower that will stagger all of the enemies for several seconds using the Stomp Bomb reaction command. Use it regularly. Use Chicken Little to keep the enemies close, and try to be precise with our spell casts. Things become a lot more difficult once Chicken Little runs out, so we can either use ethers to finish it off before that happens, or make sure to stay next to the tower and spam Stomp Bomb while we're in MP charge. Third is the room with the black hole that sucks in the furniture. This has the shortest time before the mayhem meter fills up, and it's also kind of luck. We need to quickly summon Chicken Little and pray to the Kuko gods that he uses Magnet as much as possible. If he does, we make short work of this room by simply spamming spells and maybe using an ether. If not, we have to hope a speed trap reaction command appears. Otherwise, we have no chance. Still, Chicken Little is consistent enough that this only took a few attempts. Finally is the most dangerous room, which sees us saving a burning building from catching further alight. Every once in a while, living flame enemies will spawn and head toward the building. If they touch it, the mayhem meter increases. However, once again, Chicken Little can use Magnet, which affects these flames as well as the other enemies. No, the difficult part here is instead dealing with the Hot Rod enemies, which are one of the few normal mob monsters that actually have a sort of mini desperation move, similar to what we see in bosses. As their health gets low, they'll rev up, gain a sort of attack reflecting property, and then race around the arena attempting to run Sora over. This does huge amounts of damage, as do all of their attacks, but what's more, they regularly hit Chicken Little as well, which depletes the drive gauge by a fair amount. Therefore, it's once again luck to some extent, hoping that Chicken Little graces us with his magnet. If he does, we're golden, and even if he doesn't, his attacks can break the Hot Rods out of their DM move, unlike your attacks. As long as Chicken Little doesn't go down, this isn't too much trouble, but we have to try to ration our spell and MP usage in such a way that we can use spell combos to take out the Hot Rods from just above their DM health range, so we can avoid the DM. Next is the fight to retake the Cornerstone from Modern Pete, who has stolen Retro Pete's steamboat and is trying to run off with the Cornerstone. And unfortunately, this fight apparently forces us to use our Keyblade to win. I was sure you could use spells while hanging from the hook, but apparently not, and we can't hit it while on the ground either. Since there's no way to get past this without whacking the cage with the Keyblade, we're gonna have to make a special amendment to the rules. In this specific instance, attacking with the Keyblade using the X button is okay for two reasons. Firstly, we're not attacking an enemy, we're attacking a box. And secondly, attack is swapped out for the hit command, meaning it's technically not the same? Is that good enough? Cool, because otherwise the run ends here, which would be a lame way to end this video. Winning is otherwise easy, and it gives us Donald's Comet Limit, which can prove very useful. The final section of this world is another fight with Modern Pete, which isn't all that different from the previous one in Olympus. The two new gimmicks are that Retro Pete tries to help us, and that Modern Pete will utilize the various gimmicks we saw in the rooms we cleared for Mickey. The first part has no gimmicks. The second has the flame enemies from the burning building, which Pete can summon to do huge damage to us. The third is in the room with the black hole. Here, instead of sucking in furniture, Pete can make the hole suck us toward it, but also it will cause Retro Pete to roll around, potentially doing damage to us. We can use the About Face reaction command to direct him toward his other self, however, which will stagger Modern Pete for quite a while. After this is the miniature town again. I'm not sure if Stomp Bomb works here still, because I honestly didn't need it. And finally, we end up on the construction elevator, which works like it did previously. On top of Air Slash, Retro Pete can end up falling on Modern Pete to stagger him just like he does with the About Face reaction command. This battle can be really simple if we just play it safe. If we keep our distance, Pete loves to just bowl bombs at us forever, while our allies poke at him. Both the bombs, when reflected back, and our allies will do chip damage to whittle him down. Meanwhile, our job is to spam blizzard combos until our MP runs out, or fire combos if he's staggered and we can get in close. Chicken Little seems like a good idea at first, but he makes Pete more unpredictable, so it's better to just keep things simple. The only other thing to note is that Pete doesn't randomly change phases at will. He only does so at HP gates, and only when we initiate an attack on him. So, knocking his bombs back at him and ally attacks will not carry the fight forward. And in fact, Pete will also stop taking damage at that point until we attack him ourselves. Luckily, it doesn't have to be a finisher nor a physical attack that hits him, so we just have to be wary of when his health stops going down. With that fight over, we're done with this world. Our rewards are threefold. Firstly, we gain access to the monochrome Keyblade, which can be useful for making better use of ethers when in MP charge. We also finally get the Reflect spell, which will only increase in value as we keep going. And we get Wisdom form. Unlike Valor, Wisdom levels up simply by killing Heartless when in said form. This means we can start leveling it right now to gain access to more MP Rage and our first movement ability, Quick Run, by just spamming spells on Heartless. After a short grind session to level Wisdom form as far as it'll go right now, it's time to enter Port Royal. This world isn't necessarily easy, but luckily its gimmicks are designed just for us. Most of the fights here are with cursed pirates, which are invincible when enshrouded in darkness, but become vulnerable by the light of the moon. And by vulnerable, I mean they become extremely weak to magic. They even have special responses to our spells, freezing in place when we use Blizzard, being paralyzed by thunder, and burning by fire. The first fight is a forced loss, whether we lose most of our health or time out. After that, we fight the pirates for real. At least I thought. I'm pretty sure I lost here, but the game kept going. Whatever, free experience. Further fights won't be though, since the pirates do a ton of damage, and specifically the axe pirates start into attacks extremely quickly, similar to the lance soldiers. The first few fights after this aren't notable in any way. After them is a fight on Isla de Muerta against yet more pirates. These ones are infinite, because the goal is to survive for a certain amount of time. This isn't too difficult as long as we don't get greedy for experience. There are always several pirates out at once, and it's easy for them to catch us by surprise. Chicken Little and a bit of running around should see this go by easily though. Shortly thereafter comes the first forced fight on the ship. Pirates are trying to steal a medallion from us. If one attacks us, they'll grab it, meaning we have to kill that enemy in a certain amount of time or they'll escape with it and we fail. There are a lot of pirates here, meaning multiple MP bars and probably a full use of Chicken Little. Still, by keeping our cool and avoiding the cannon fire coming from the nearby pirate ship, we scrape by. 15 seconds of kicking barrels off of our boat later, and there's only one more encounter we need to take care of, the boss fight with Barbossa. This fight comes with two gimmicks that ratchet up the difficulty. Firstly, Barbossa has a special Heartless with him, which can occasionally darken the arena, find the glowing eyes, and deplete its health to light things back up. The other issue is that the battle is lost immediately if Jack dies. This is the more pressing issue, seeing as the most effective way we have of healing Jack also prevents us from attacking until MP charge is done. Still, Jack is fairly resilient, and we also have a gimmick on our side. Barbossa follows the same rules as the normal pirates. This does mean he's invincible in shadow, which can be irritating if our allies distract him from chasing us into the light, but it also means that spells wreck him. They do tons of damage and Blizzard can freeze him in place. The best pattern I found is as follows: Blizzard Barbossa to halt him, then use fire before immediately freezing him again. If you want to spend the ethers, you can just keep this up for as long as you have the MP. Since I didn't want to do that, I chose to cast until just about out of MP and then, as usual, use a limit. Any of them work, though I found that Jack's bluff is a bit more consistent than Comet for high damage output here. This should take Barbossa down in about 3 cycles. Just be careful during the downtime because Barbossa does a lot of damage to Sora. Before long, Barbossa will be dealt with, and Port Royale's first visit will be complete. Agrabah's first visit was surprisingly easy compared to what I expected. The final fight in the Cave of Wonders is the only one that had me worried, but it was practically over before it began, much like the rest of them. There are a multitude of ways to go about this fight, like Aladdin's Limit, Chicken Little, or Reflect. I decided to focus on using the Shift Shot reaction command offered by the Silver Rocks, and the proper elemental spells for the other enemies. Near the end, tons of fiery globes and a few fat bandits appear, which is perfect for hitting multiple enemies at once with blizzard spells. After this is the boss, the Volcano and Blizzard Lords. They each offer their own reaction commands to exploit, which will briefly stun them. Other than that, use Fire on the Blizzard Lord and Blizzard on the Volcano Lord, and Ethers to regain MP. Super easy. For beating Agrabah, we gain access to Summon Boost to keep our summons out for longer, and the Lamp Charm, which allows us to call upon Genie for help, which we won't do. At this point, we gain access to 2 options. We can go to Twilight Town again, or Halloween Town. I figured Halloween Town would be a pain, so I went there first to get it over with. This world is pretty standard until we get to Curly Hill. Prison Keeper gave me a ton of trouble on level 1, but it actually becomes significantly easier if you spend most of your time evading. Trying to use Keyblade combos actually makes getting hit much more likely here. This boss will take turns devouring one of the 3 kids, Lock, Shock, and Barrel. Barrel is the most dangerous since it means Prison Keeper will focus on physical attacks. Shock can actually hit you a lot easier since Prison Keeper starts spinning and shooting tons of dark orbs from its fingertips, but this does much less damage than the physical attacks, and we can use the collision of the hail as cover. Lock is the most advantageous for us by far though, since he causes Prison Keeper to do nothing but throw giant fire orbs at us. Orbs that we can reflect using block to damage him. Simply stay away from Prison Keeper, use single blizzard spells whenever we have MP, reflect the fire orbs, and focus mostly on not getting hit. Eventually, Prison Keeper will eat all 3 children, but at least for me, it mostly just spammed physical attacks and fire orbs from then on. The battle takes a bit, but we're almost never actually in danger of getting hit. Finally, we have the fight with Oogie Boogie. This one was the most challenging of the bunch. Avoiding the first attack is simple with Quick Run. The real challenge is not getting hit by the enemies he'll occasionally summon. Still, if we just switch to another conveyor belt, we're good. I'm not sure if that causes the enemies to despawn if you wait long enough, or if they hit the spikes at the rear of the belts and die, but regardless, the enemies seemed to disappear after about 10 seconds away from them. Play it safe, don't try to defeat the mob enemies, and then all we have to do is simply get presents into Oogie Boogie's elevator whenever we can. Every 12 presents will cause him to come crashing down. Oogie is then permanently staggered until we do a set amount of damage to him. Repeat 3 times, with an easy-to-avoid lightning attack thrown in near the end, and we've beat Halloween Town. For doing so, we get the useful but extremely expensive Magnet spell. It's at this point that I decided to get Twilight Town over with. There's only one fight here, but it introduces the Berserker Nobodies, which as far as I can tell can only be easily knocked away from their swords using Keyblade finishers. This means we cannot use the reaction command tied to them. A shame since they hit like a fleet of trucks, and some of their attacks come fast. Chicken Little actually gets in the way in this fight since he's unpredictable, so instead play it smart. The first wave is just a bunch of dusks. Goofy Tornado often keeps them all close so that we can spam fire, but better luck we'll see Goofy and Donald doing very little. The dusks will quickly surround us, at which point we can wait for one to attack, use Reflect, which costs less than fire, and deal massive damage. The second wave is more dusks, and a single Berserker. If we're fast, we can get between the Berserker and its sword to use Reflect. Once it gets to about half health, it will exclusively use its little desperation move of sorts, where it becomes tiny and starts slamming its sword everywhere, ending in an area of effect blast. Once again, just use Reflect. The final wave is 3 Berserkers. After some experimentation, I realized that simply hitting them with Blizzard when safe was an effective way to get their health low enough to cause the DM. After that, they're done for. For beating this single battle, we get Oathkeeper, which can be useful if we want the extra point in magic. However, I chose to keep on the Hidden Dragon, since the MP Rage on it stacks with the one we got earlier. MP Rage is often a decent way to get more efficient battles, since taking intentional damage will sometimes nearly fill our MP all the way back up. We also gain access to Limit Form. This is what I was referring to in the beginning when I said it was difficult to word the rule related to how we can use drive forms. Technically, you can level Limit Form without pressing X or square to attack, and without hitting enemies with your Keyblade. You see, Limit Form actually gains an experience by using the finishers of the limits it has. It doesn't matter whether you hit an enemy, though you do have to be in combat to use the limits. This means you can technically spawn enemies, run away, and then use the limit on absolutely nothing. This will still give you the experience, but you're not actually hitting anything with your Keyblade. It took me quite a lot of thought to decide whether this should be against the rules or not. I even ended up leveling Limit Form twice this way, but ultimately I decided it is against the rules since even though they're performed differently, the only thing Limit Form does is Keyblade combos. I think Quick Run should be enough anyway. Hopefully we won't need Dodge Roll, though it is indeed a useful alternative. Pridelands is a scary one at first glance. Since we lose access to every limit outside of Simba's, we can't block, we can't use drive forms, and we can't use summons. Spells also don't seem to have finishers here either. Luckily, this visit goes easy on us. That doesn't mean the fights aren't dangerous, mind you. The first fight may only be against 2 living bones, but they can easily stunlock us to death in under a second with their spinning attack. Keeping them distracted is our best option. We can use Magnet, then spam other spells, Reflect, or if you're lucky like me, Goofy will use Goofy Tornado to stun lock them. Interestingly, we don't have any more forced fights until we get to the end. At that point we have a fight with Shenzi, Bonsai, and Ed while keeping Pumbaa safe. I tried to use the speedrun strat here since it's one of the few strats I remember. In this strategy, you effectively trick the AI of the 3 hyenas into attacking you in a synchronized manner, at which point you reflect. They take damage, and they retaliate by doing the exact same thing. It kind of worked for me at points, but by the end I had to instead rely on the iframes Pumbaa gets when you tell him to follow you with his reaction command. The attacks of the hyenas don't actually seem to be able to hit Sora when they're targeting Pumbaa, so we can just MP charge and reaction command through them until we can spam spells to finish them off. Right after this is the fight with Scar, which is really dangerous if we miss a reflect, but timing them right will lead to big damage and little effort to take the grumpy lion down. This world gives us access to the Circle of Life Keyblade, which offers MP Haste as an ability. Worth keeping in mind if we ever have to rely on MP charge instead of Ethers in the future, but for now the Hidden Dragon is still a better option. And some people think this Keyblade is useless. Space Paranoids is another short one, with 4 minigames and a single boss fight being required across the entire first visit. The third minigame we run across is the Light Cycle, which luckily isn't made more difficult by the fact that we can't use the attack command. Still, it's just difficult for me in general. As such, it took a few tries. Somewhere in here we gain access to both Stitch outside of the computer and Master Form. Stitch is a powerhouse for this sort of challenge. We'll touch on Master Form a bit later. Finally, we have the challenge where you have to defeat enemies to gain orbs, so you can freeze the 3 monitors. These Heartless do little damage, so missing Reflex isn't too bad, so we spam away. And then we get to the boss, Hostile Program. This boss can kill us pretty easily, but now that Tron has his powers back, we have access to his limit, his setup. I found that Tron and Donald are pretty competent here, and will usually get enough orbs out of Hostile Program by themselves so that we can trigger the freeze reaction command. This freezes the boss until the gauge runs out. We use all of our MP on thunder attacks until we're about to run out, then we use setup. This will provide immunity to damage for quite a while, do a large chunk of damage to the boss, and nearly always make him drop enough orbs to be frozen again. Use an Ether to skip through most of MP charge, wait until our MP is just about back up, then freeze Hostile Program and repeat. It gets a little tougher near the end as the boss starts moving faster and faster and uses more dangerous attacks, but by focusing on collecting orbs, it wasn't too hard. The only thing we get here that we can use is the Photon Debugger Keyblade, which offers a 20% boost to thunder damage. We don't use it. Now that we're out of Space Paranoids, we can do a few things before the tough challenge ahead. Firstly, take care of this forced battle, in which the most dangerous enemies are the Crimson Jazz at the end and the Dancers. Still, by keeping our head, we can reflect everything to death without even needing to use an Ether, or we can use Stitch, though I do believe you'll get your drive refilled after this battle as long as Stitch is still out when it's done, so that would probably have been the easier option. Now, it's time to level up Wisdom Form once more, which gives us another MP Haste ability, and to fully level up Master Form as far as it'll go right now. Master Form levels by collecting Drive Orbs. Since the entrance to the Cavern of Remembrance just opened up, we can travel in and out repeatedly and collect all of the Drive Orbs from the strange ball object right inside. It takes about 15 minutes to max it out at this point, giving us Aerial Dodge 2. This is not only good for extra height, and offers horizontal speed and distance, but it has reflective iframes too, which we can use to avoid damage while reflecting projectiles. However, it's worth noting that depending on how you would want to interpret the rules, I kind of broke said rules a bit here without realizing it. I didn't know it at this point, but Master Form does physical pokes with the floating Keyblade when you're using spells. This means getting close to use Thunder on the ball means I'm also technically swinging my Keyblade and hitting the ball. It was at the end of the game when I realized this and I was mortified. Luckily, I then did a bit of experimenting and realized that Magnet allows us to avoid hitting the ball with the Keyblade, but still farm the drive orbs, so you can level it up without hitting the ball with your Keyblade, though this means we can't really use Master Form in battle. I suppose it's a good thing that I didn't. Once the grinding is done, the next fight is just more of the same. In this case, I summoned Stitch for safety, since there are a lot of dancers here. He kept my MP refilled, and would block basic attacks when I missed my reflect timing, but also if we take a serious hit, Stitch will usually stagger enemies, forcing them to drop a plethora of HP orbs. Next up is a Gauntlet, the opening act of which is a legitimate fight with the Demyx. Demyx can combo us to death with several attacks, and we often have to expend a lot of MP to reflect through his attacks. Also, for some reason, fire doesn't do that much to him unless we are in a drive form, meaning reflect will honestly be our big damage dealer. The fight starts with more water clones like it did in Olympus. Summon Stitch and focus on using fire whenever the wild dance reaction command isn't available. We can do this with Wisdom form, but Stitch can easily be kept active throughout the entire battle, unlike Wisdom. Besides, Stitch can sometimes use his HP orb stagger ability, which decimates the water clones. Once that's over, use a few fire combos on Demyx. When he responds with water pillars, wait for him to do the linear set of them. If we position ourselves correctly, the reflect will hit him. Most of this battle is fairly standard in terms of how careful we need to be, and when he provides his openings. The challenge comes in not being comboed to death. With that battle done, here comes the scary part. We immediately need to do 4 separate mob fights where Final Fantasy characters will come to help us. These battles aren't hard, but one wrong move during any of them will send us all the way back to before we fought Demyx. Even though our allies are really competent here, I clenched pretty hard. After that is the 1000 Heartless Challenge, which goes more or less how it would otherwise. No combos? No problem, because the Rising Sun and Sparkle Ray reaction commands are actually faster and can even be safer, so we save our MP for Cure instead. With that done, we're halfway through the game. It's now time for our revisits to each world, most of which are really short and simple. Land of Dragons is up first. At the mountain summit is a battle with Riku. We don't have to beat him completely, just do a couple of bars of damage, reflect him when safe, and use Speed Trap to do easy damage. Next is a Heartless battle in the Palace Square. Chicken Little is still slightly luck-based, but he offers a cheaper magnet than the one we have, so I use that to my advantage. Not an easy fight, but not a difficult one either. Then we go inside the palace and have to fight a bunch of sniper nobodies. This is extremely easy since it's such a tight hallway. Since I still had Chicken Little ready, his magnet breaks this fight. Magnet, spam fire, pick up MP orbs to avoid using ethers, and that's about it. Now we've made it to the Storm Rider. Storm Rider is a bit difficult, but quick reactions can deal with it. Our goal is to stay on its back as long as we can. Don't destroy its lightning rods. Instead, stand up at the horns and reflect the lightning it shoots. Use the hang on reaction command when necessary, and the rest of the battle is fairly standard. Moving to the Beast's Castle revisit, we have a few easy mob fights that can be trivialized using Stitch and Thunder Magic. Then comes Xaldin, who is fairly straightforward too. Reflect or block his basic attacks to get a bunch of jump commands. His major strengths are his DM, which keeps him out of our reach for quite a while, and the faster, trickier basic attacks he'll start using in the second half of the fight. Still, well-timed reflex will deal with everything. Stitch can keep our MP topped up when we need, as well as help us avoid some attacks. Reflecting Xaldin's later attacks usually leads to his Sky Spear attack, which guarantees 9 full jump commands, as long as we're not asleep at the wheel. With this world done, we get Reflera. Olympus, upon revisit, is much easier than before. The only fight worth noting is the fight with Hades. We primarily need to use Hercules' Aura Spheres to damage Hades and make him vulnerable. To maximize MP use efficiency, we can hit Hades with all of the Aura Spheres that appear, rather than just one to make him vulnerable. Safely reflecting Hades' attacks the rest of the time while avoiding the rain of fireballs isn't too difficult. Pirates in Port Royal are still as dangerous as before, but still as vulnerable too, so the initial fight is easy work. Then we'll do our first fight against the Grim Reaper. This is simple, since Grumpy Grimpy over here reacts to magic just like the pirates, and its patterns here are extremely simple. Bait an attack and then air reflect. We'll get horizontal slash from it, which serves no purpose here. After some shenanigans that involve more medallions is the real fight with Grim Reaper, which is no joke. The main idea is that we need to freeze the boss in place with Blizzard, collect the medallions it drops, and then use Thunder on it to drop more medallions. Then, back up and repeat the process. If we're lucky, the boss will keep trying to retaliate with the same attack until we deplete its stock of medallions. Put them in the chest, and it'll become vulnerable to real damage. During this phase, we can play it just like we did in the previous fight by reflecting his basic attacks. This battle has a few phases you're forced through, but the main differences are the amount of medallions the boss will grab initially each time, and the fact that it'll sometimes use a DM attack. The DM is easy to avoid by jumping on these boxes. However, it seems like if you take too long to collect all the medallions, Grim Reaper will almost immediately revert back to its invulnerable phase and steal the medallions back. Still, by playing a little more risky, I was able to take him down. Finishing this visit upgrades Magnet and gives us the glorious Duck Flare limit for Donald. Agrabah's revisit is largely a gimmick visit. Most of it will be done on the magic carpet. You have most of your options on the carpet for all but one part. The initial few sections are pretty basic. The auto-scroller section is the first real challenge, since it strips us of every option except for Keyblade attacks. This is another place where I thought I might have to use the Keyblade, but luckily, you don't actually have to kill any enemies. The main thing to be wary of is the hook bats. Once they start twirling around, it may seem like you need to avoid them when they launch at you, but actually they're only really dangerous if you touch them while they spin in place. Since we can't cure, this took a few tries, but it wasn't too bad. Finally, we've got stupid Genie Jafar, who is usually one of the easiest bosses in the game. His retaliations almost always miss us, the first half of the battle sees him doing almost nothing, and he spends an eternity staggered. The goal is to poke at his rock-hard abs until he doubles over, then damage his head and use roll-up right before he recovers to get time so that we can do even more damage. I'm a big dumb idiot, so I used fire here, since it was doing more damage than Blizzard for some reason, and it takes less MP, meaning I could get more spells out. Problem is, Jafar bobs around so much that many of my fires would miss, some outright. So Blizzard is a smarter option, as is using Circle of Life instead of Hidden Dragon, since getting a quicker MP charge is more important here than MP Rage. We need to be careful to hit MP charge at the right times or we're screwed. Once Genie Jafar starts summoning fireballs, we more or less have to use Reflect to avoid them while doing damage to his stomach. We really don't have time to do anything else, and even then I couldn't completely avoid damage without comboing Reflex, which is a waste of MP. Jafar is no joke here, and honestly the only reason he wasn't hair-pullingly frustrating was because his DM does very little damage to us and allows us to charge our MP fully. Halloween Town is luckily easier upon revisit. Halfway through the world, we enter a fight that requires us to gather 4 presents from Heartless. This can become a massive undertaking if you take too long, but if you do it right by summoning Chicken Little to use Magnet and then spamming fire, it can be over in 10 seconds. I could have probably also used Magnet myself, but it wasn't in my quick select, so... Later, after the present making minigame, we have the boss fight with Experiment. This fight isn't easy, but it's not near as bad as it was on level 1. We start by finally unleashing the godly ability that is Duck Flare for tons of free damage. Once that's done, summon Stitch. Use Cure as needed, but our primary objective is to use Reflect on Experiment until it breaks apart. Once it does, use Kick Spring and hope that it actually works. This is the easiest part of the battle to die on because we can so easily be juggled by the spinning head section. When it finally joins back together, we go back to reflecting. Repeat until it gets low before dismissing Stitch and using Duck Flare to finish things off. For winning, we'll get the true Ultima weapon, Decisive Pumpkin, but it won't be of any use to us here, so let it rot in your inventory. RIP Best Keyblade. Pridelands is simultaneously way easier on revisit and way more difficult. The first fight is with the 3 hyenas again. This is a joke, but it's also pretty boring. All they do is run away from us. Luckily, they will eventually stop, meaning we can just skulk behind them until ready to go on the offensive. When ready, run up, lock on, use Thunder to get them airborne, and then spam fire until we're out of MP. They'll run a ways away before stopping again. Catch up, but don't get too close. Let our MP recharge and then repeat. The Ground Shaker boss is the only part left, and this is quite a bit more dangerous than Scar was. More or less, our best option is just spamming Simba's Wildcat limit whenever we can. This will take the boss out in 3 or 4 uses. The rest of the battle is best spent far away from the massive beast, so that we can safely recharge our MP. Trying anything else will almost guarantee that we get walloped, so just don't get greedy. Our final Disney world is Space Paranoids again, which is much harder this time around. The first battle is with a bunch of extremely dangerous Heartless, including the Devastator type. However, with Reflect, we're fine. Next up is a fight that primarily consists of a bunch more Devastators. This can get tricky, but using Stitch can really help. If we primarily focus on spacing and Reflect only when necessary, we can double down on spamming Thunder Magic on a single Devastator at a time. It took quite a few tries, but I got this one done without much effort by just playing it cool. The final mob fight here is with a bunch of Heartless, including yet again more Devastators. But what makes this harder is that we're on a Solar Sailor, which can only hold so much weight. If the meter maxes out, we lose. So this time we need to skip the Reflex as much as possible and just spam Thunder because it's faster. With luck, Stitch will keep us in MP, otherwise this fight is near impossible without our Keyblade. I could have probably switched the Photon Debugger Keyblade to make Thunder more effective, but I finished this battle before I needed to. The boss fight here comes in 2 phases, and yet again, if we fail the later one, we have to restart both. It's best to equip the Circle of Life Keyblade to speed up MP recharge here. The first phase is just Sark and a few Heartless. It's boring and easy, with the focus being on reflecting his disc to stagger him for a while. When applicable, we can spam Tron's setup limit to make things go faster, but we also need to try to have as much MP as possible when we start the next battle. Now that we're fighting Giant Fetish Sark and the MCP, the real danger begins. MCP is only vulnerable when we destroy some of his firewalls, and even when we do, they'll frequently spin around, forcing a chase. They also shoot powerful lasers later on, and your allies love to knock themselves out on these firewalls constantly. This is particularly annoying since we can only safely damage MCP when Sark's unconscious, which is a limited window, but we need Tron alive to use the delete reaction command to do said damage. So effectively, this is a frantic mess of a battle for the first half. Most of our time is spent using Reflect on Sark's ankles, and then slowly knocking him out with jumping fire spells. Sark does offer up a reaction command that will instantly knock him out, which when I was doing my level 1 run, I remember being able to do from the beginning of the fight. But according to randoms on the internet, you can't do the reaction command until the fight is around half over. And that's what happened here, so take that as you will. Regardless, we can run away from Sark whenever we need to charge MP. If we're lucky, he'll summon a wall to stop us, allowing us to use the high climb reaction command, which will immediately KO him. Then it's all about finding an opening in the firewall and keeping Tron alive long enough to use delete. Also, we don't want to waste time trying to destroy all of the walls, or even a large chunk of them, since the MCP will just create more if we take away too many. Once that difficult battle is done, it's time to move on to the final stretch. For winning, we finally get Reflega, so according to the internet, we're officially now truly OP. The fight with Axel by our side is the first notable encounter once we get to Twilight Town, because the mob configuration is a bit aggressive, and we lose Donald and Goofy. Still, the arena is more than large enough to avoid the enemies extremely easily, so we can let Axel do his thing while occasionally spamming spells or reflects, whatever is safest in the moment. Finishing this gives us the Bond of Flame Keyblade, which does extra fire damage, but more importantly, it also has a magic stat of 4, which is the highest we've gotten up to this point, and now is when we want to equip it. The next fight is with Roxas, which took me around 6 hours. In fact, I ended up stopping my recording to take a break and came back later to practice different strategies. It was during this practice, while I wasn't recording, that I initially beat Roxas, so I saved the clip complete with ugly copyright watermark from my console. When I finally got back to recording the next day, I decided to go back to the file I'd saved before beating Roxas and try to do it again. It took another 20 minutes, but I got it again. So how do you beat Roxas, and why is he so difficult without a Keyblade? Well, not only do we have very few options against Roxas already, since Donald and Goofy aren't with us, but we also have even less options in this challenge since we can't use Limit Form for anything but healing, filling MP, and dodge rolling attacks. We more or less have to use basic spells, items, and Reflect to beat him. But it gets even worse when you realize that we also can't utilize the End reaction command where we steal Roxas Keyblades. It's fairly random whether he decides to force you into this reaction command, and a lot of the times it never showed up. But when it did, it was a problem, and since we're only level 36, we don't have second chance. That means we have to successfully do the reaction command or we die instantly. But once we do, Roxas gets much more dangerous since he starts spamming powerful laser attacks that can't be used against him since he's always too far away for Reflect to hit him. On top of that, we can't quick run or jump near him since the Keyblades that he gives us enter attack mode automatically and can accidentally tag Roxas, breaking the rules of the run. Even when we don't steal Roxas Keyblades, once we get his health to 1/3 of the way down, he starts spamming those same lasers with all of his basic attacks as well. There are a few ways to deal with this, but only one of them is consistent. He's dangerous for a host of other reasons, but that's the gist of it. With all of that in mind, we can beat Roxas in one of 3 ways. Firstly, we can be ultra careful and focus on reflecting only when necessary. During the initial phase, this means we mostly quick run away for safety when he gets close. If he uses his AoE spin attack, we wait in safety. If he uses his jumping spiral, we reflect. If he uses his combo, we close in a bit and try to put him in between us and the edge of the arena. If we stay close enough to the wall, this is consistent and means we can reflect him and hit him. The main reason for this specific pattern is because just reflecting his last hit anywhere in the arena has a high chance of the reflect explosions dealing little to no damage because Roxas moves out of range. Regardless, we want to have the Bond of Flame equipped because reflect does damage based not on how many attacks you reflect or physical strength, but rather our magic stat. Since it has the highest magic stat for a Keyblade we have access to, it deals the most damage. Anyway, once we get him past the first phase, he'll start using lasers. We more or less do the same thing here, but this time we have to either quick run around the combo of lasers, or be in a specific position to block the main combo. Doing it just right means the lasers will all miss us. Doing it wrong means we're probably dead. The second way to take care of Roxas is to use a sort of variation on the speedrun loop. With the right combination of attacks, we can loop Roxas for most of the fight. However, the normal version of the loop uses limit form limits and Keyblade attacks. While I was attempting this, and ranting a bit on the Resonant Arc Discord's Kingdom Hearts section, another user by the name of Karasu decided it'd be fun to attempt the same fight. They succeeded hours before me using this method, and did it at level 1 on top of that. I'll leave the video in the description if you want to check it out, because it's super impressive. The third way to beat Roxas focuses on blocking in the first half and reflecting in the second half. Instead of avoiding the main combo early in the fight, we get in Roxas' face and block. Time it right and it'll block the first part of the combo. Guard again and we'll block the second half. Then we can reflect the final slash to deal damage to Roxas a good 80% of the time, since doing it this way seems to mean he consistently ends up closer to us than otherwise. This also gives us the chance to reflect his spin attack, since if we block and he doesn't attack, he'll go straight into that, meaning we're already right next to him and can time a perfect reflect spell. Once the lasers come, get ready to spam items. I tried to avoid doing this, but ended up having to use it for both of my victories here. Since I can't consistently deal with the lasers and stay close to Roxas, this method just had me reflecting through the entire combo. This ensures that we're close enough to hit him with reflect most times, and keeps us safe. Problem is, it means we're downing ethers like they're candy. If we don't kill him before we run out, we have a problem. We're effectively brute forcing the second half of the fight this way. It feels cheap, but it's doable. And with Roxas finally down, we've only got a few fights left. Roxas gives us the 2 become 1 Keyblade, which allows us to easily access Final Form. However, leveling Final Form without hitting enemies with our Keyblade would be a tedious nightmare, since both blades hover around us nearby and attack enemies when we take almost any action. I think you could do it, but I really don't want to waste my time and I don't think we'll need it, so we won't be getting Glide during this playthrough unfortunately. Still, it's worth unlocking the form regardless, because doing so means we can max out Wisdom and Master Form to get the best versions of Quick Run and Aerial Dodge. Our first fight in the world that never was proper is with Xigbar. It took me a decent handful of tries, but unlike with Roxas, we have a lot of options at our disposal. Equip Circle of Life for MP haste and start the battle by casting Duck Flare. Since the battle is still in its early phase, we don't want to waste an Ether yet. Instead, we can let MP charge go naturally since Xigbar is so non-aggressive right now. Donald should keep us healthy while we block all of the arrows fired at us, and surprisingly, Donald doesn't die that often here either, meaning it's easy to go straight back into Duck Flare once our MP is filled. Once we've gotten through the second limit, we can use an Ether and a High Potion if we're worried. We then have to wait for the dregs of our MP to finish charging, then we can use Duck Flare again when safe. By this point, Xigbar is hitting fast, hitting hard, and probably using his DM. Surviving it is the same as usual with this fight. It's mostly just about being careful. Ether again, and finish him off with a final Duck Flare or two. Next up is stupid, dumb, awful Luxord, the worst fight in this game if you ask me. I'm not exactly a fan of the fact that Data Luxord requires you to beat his more difficult DM to win, considering that it's a random minigame rather than something combat related. Luckily, that's not the case here. However, he forces us into dice form at the beginning, and if we're not ready, he will always cheap shot us immediately. Once out of dice form, we can take this battle slow. We're rarely in any danger if we're careful. When safe, it's best to flip his nearby cards, which always forces him to start a game with us. Winning the game stuns him, allowing us to pelt him with spells. If we're safe about this, we don't have to worry about running out of MP and going into MP charge, because he won't be too aggressive. Eventually though, he will do his DM. It's not a big deal if we fail, though it is dangerous. Luckily, losing doesn't massively deplete our time gauge, nor fill his own like it does against Data Luxord, so we can just keep playing like normal and he'll go down. Overall, dangerous and slow, but fairly simple. Cyax is next, and this battle is fairly straightforward until the very brutal last quarter. Immediately summon Stitch. Cyax will then berserk around like a loser for a while. Our goal is to avoid his attacks and then take our chance to catch a sword. Story Cyax is kind of a junky fight, since it takes a while for the berserk reaction command to show up, but we're not invincible while hovering around holding the sword, unlike in the data version. Still, early on it's not too difficult to avoid damage. Using this reaction command will knock Cyax out of berserk, making him extra vulnerable. However, he'll immediately start charging it back up. While charging his berserk gauge, Cyax will try to attack. Using Reflect can stun him, deal damage, and make him drop his weapon in a single action. Pick up the sword, and when the reaction command shows up, smack him to high heavens. Since he's not in berserk, it'll do a good chunk more damage than it would otherwise. We need to repeat this as much as we can before he enters berserk again, which he'll do faster and faster as he gets more beat up. Eventually, Cyax will start doing his DM, which sucks hard when you don't have access to glide or high jump at all. If we survive, that's our cue to take him out as quickly as possible. By that point, Stitch is usually nearly gone. This means we need to make sure we have some MP remaining when he leaves, so we can use Duck Flare the next time Cyax is vulnerable. From this point, we have to sort of improvise. I scrounged up enough drive to call Stitch out again, though you could wait and use another Duck Flare. Once he's down, we're finally at the last chunk of fights. Xemnas 1 doesn't pose much of a challenge. His combos are easy to avoid if we're playing safe, and we can close into use Reflect to deal damage at the end. We don't want to try and reflect his basic guard attacks since he can combo through them and a single reflect won't last long enough to avoid said combo. Instead, we only reflect his double hit and the end of his long combo. Eventually, he'll start nearly always double hitting out of his guard, which then allows us to deplete his health much faster. When the fight's just about to wrap up, he'll do the building reaction command, and we can take out all the rest of his health by waiting for the third prompt to show up. A quick thunder will end the battle from there. Now we're entering the gauntlet. After slicing up a few buildings, we end up standing in front of a giant laser cannon. At first, I was a dumb idiot and was trying to use thunder on the bomb enemies. Eventually, I wised up though and used magnet, which sends them into the cannons en masse, and for much less MP. At the door section, we spam fire. When threatened by the enemies that can appear, we can summon Stitch if we need to. Another section where taking it slow is best. Once that's over, we have the first fight against Armor Xemnas. He seems like he might pose a threat at first, but he's legit a joke. Stitch will keep you safe if you want to play a little looser, but we can beat him without taking any damage by standing just outside of the reach of his barrier. Doing so will manipulate him into going between the barrier and his wide swinging sword attack. The swing can be reflected, and if you're standing in the right spot, he'll take the reflect damage. Meanwhile, that same spot is just outside of the range of his barrier, meaning we can safely reflect it not once, but twice. This is the freest fight in the game, honestly. Finish that, and it'll be just us and Riku for the final stretch. The first section is another auto-scroller on a flying bike thing. Luckily, we don't have to use attack here because the barrier and laser attacks work just fine. With that over comes the second fight with Armor Xemnas. This is a bit more dangerous. He uses lasers to hit us if we aren't right up in his face, and at set HP values, he'll launch us across space, where we'll then have to reapproach by smacking buildings at him. Literally. But the same tactic as before still applies, meaning this is the second easiest fight in the run, just behind the first fight with Armor Xemnas. With all of that done, it's time for the real fight with the true Zebra himself, Final Xemnas. This would have been torture if we were on any other version of Final Mix, since his opening reaction command is broken in every other version besides the non-Final Mix PS2 version. Luckily, Square fixed it in a patch on the PS4. If they hadn't, we'd have to rely on Riku's session limit here. With that first reversal section out of the way, the battle is a pretty safe bet most of the way through. Xemnas will deal lots of damage that's difficult to avoid, and it's hard to hit him consistently since he teleports everywhere. However, Riku cannot die, and can charge his MP extremely fast, to the point where he can give us a health potion every 10 seconds or so. So all we have to do is try and tag Xemnas where we can, and otherwise focus on staying alive. Eventually, he'll start using lots of lasers, but it's still mostly just as easy to survive. I personally focused on just staying healthy because Xemnas will leave this phase after a while, usually by doing the minigame where he captures Sora and you have to play as Riku. Therefore, we want to make sure that we have as much HP as possible when this happens. Just like normal, we can poke the Xemnas clone with dark aura spheres to keep him at bay while we reach Sora. After that, Xemnas goes back to his normal phase again, which allows us to continue whittling his health down until we enter the Mega Ultra Omega Uber Laser Dome of Doom and Darkness. And from that point, we'd have to fall asleep at the controller to lose. Once it's over, another quick thunder will end him, and signify the end of the run. This run could probably be pushed further by getting rid of all of the combat reaction commands that may potentially use the Keyblade. A lot of work, but if you put enough time into going frame by frame through these reaction commands, you could probably narrow it down to the ones you are and aren't allowed to do. And you could no doubt also do this challenge at level 1 if you wanted, but honestly, I don't think it would make that much of a difference in difficulty. Regardless, the only real times you have to use the Keyblade are during the Rock Shatter reaction command and during the fight with the Steamboat box, if I'm remembering correctly, which surprised me a fair bit. I thought we'd have to use it a lot more. The hardest part was no doubt Roxas, though there were definitely bits that were far more tedious, particularly the fights that don't have checkpoints in between them. The time I spent fighting Roxas flew by. The time I spent doing things like Thresholder was torture. Anyway, tell me what you guys thought in the comments below, like the video if you enjoyed it, check out some of my other videos like my recent critique of Kingdom Hearts 3 if they look interesting, and subscribe if you're not and you enjoy what I have on offer. See you guys next time.